What's up? This is another quick demo basically about how you want to tile textures to get coverage of big spaces in Unreal. This will involve some use of the materials editor in Unreal, so if you haven't looked at the epic intro to materials video series, I will link that again in the description. If you haven't done any materials stuff in Unreal yet, then I would recommend looking at that before this video. But anyway, tiling textures. This is a little annoying to do in Unreal. At least compared to older games editors, but luckily there's a few different ways you can do it. So starting out here, I have this example level that I set up, and if I run around in it, you can see I have this really big floor piece, and the concrete texture on it is just it's not tiling, it's just a planar map to the whole thing, and obviously it's kind of low res, it's too big. You would want this to be a lot smaller. So what can we do about that? So in Maya, here's the same mesh, and obviously, you know, I could just scale up the UVs, export that back out, and re-import, and I have the UVs tiling, right? So that's the manual way to do it, and there are a lot of cases where that's actually the best solution. However, that's also annoying a lot of the time, and sometimes it's not convenient. So I'm going to undo that and put it back the way it was. Alright, so what else can we do? I'm gonna resave this real quick. So here's my demo material, and as you can see, it's just really straight ahead, straightforward. Nothing special about it, but there's about to be, because I'm gonna make a texture coordinate node, and the texture coordinate is just the UVs. It's sort of default UVs. Down here you can see a few settings, but we're just gonna leave that the way it is for a second. On a texture sampler node, you can see there is a UVs input, and if I connect this texture coordinate, nothing happens, because if you don't connect anything to the UVs on a texture sample node, it's just going to use the default settings. So this is redundant. I'm basically saying use the default settings, and it already is, so it doesn't care. However, like here I have U tiling and V tiling, so if I set that to 2, suddenly I'm overriding the default settings with this new texture coordinate, and if I hit apply, you should see it update. And now I've tiled the base color but not the other two maps, so I would need to also connect it down here. So now I have it tiling at a more reasonable scale, and I could even turn it, you know, turn those tiling numbers higher to get it tiling more frequently, but this is good for now. So that's one way to do it. However, this doesn't afford you a ton of control, and if you looked at the Unreal Materials stuff, you will know about parameters and how useful those can be. So real quick, I'm going to create an instance of tiling demo mat, and nothing in it to do yet, but I'll save that and go back to the main material. So if I disconnect these, the UVs, I'm going to change these actually back to 1 and 1 in the texture coordinate node. So it's putting out basically a vector 2, so 2 numerical values. And if I wanted to create a scalar parameter, just call it UV tiling, default value of 1, and multiply that by the UVs that I'm getting from the texture coordinate. So now I'm multiplying the UVs by 1, so nothing happens. But let me plug it in again and apply it. Now let me grab my material instance, and if I open up the UV tiling parameter and set that to 2, if I set it to 2, I get, oh wait, gotta put the instance on here. Okay, so I set it to 2, set it to 1, you can change the tiling, and that's awesome. That's already a big improvement. you may find that you would rather control the U and the V separately. So what you would do for that would be to duplicate this off. I'm just going to call this now U tiling, and this one V tiling. And I want to turn these into a vector 2, so I'm going to use the append vector node. So now I have the U and the V as separate parameters, but they're being appended into a vector, and I can multiply this vector 2 by the vector 2 UVs coming out of here, and hopefully that should work. Yeah, so now obviously the U tiling is set to 3, V is at 1, but I can change that. You can basically scale these however you want. You can really screw it up if you feel like it, but now you have control, and obviously you can slide these, which is great. This is one way to do it. There is one issue here, which is a lot of the time in Unreal, if you're working quickly especially, maybe you need to fit a piece in somewhere and you don't want to model a custom piece, so then, you know, you scale it non-uniformly in Unreal. And now this is stretched, so one thing I could do is create another instance, throw that on here, and then try to compensate, right, in the scale. So now this is being scaled non-uniformly in the material in the opposite direction of the mesh. But this sucks. This is really inefficient. Like, if you kept doing this, you would have so many material instances and it would just be a disaster. So what else can you do? I have one more thing to show you. I'm going to now, let me see, just going to delete all of this. So we're back to our default material. But what I want to show you now is called the World Align Texture node. And it comes with a World Align normal cousin node because it doesn't work for a normal map. So what this does is it is going to project your textures. Basically, it's going to planar project your textures in world space, so they tile infinitely on the X, Y, and the Z axes. And that way, well, I'll demonstrate it, but that way you basically don't have to worry about your UVs. Now, you can't actually plug a texture sample in here. It wants a texture object. And a texture object is basically just the texture. A texture sample is a node that holds the texture, but it also holds the UVs, and it holds some other information that governs how this is treated. But if you change it to a texture object, you can right-click Convert to Texture Object, or you can make texture object the regular way. Now I can plug this into the text on the texture sample, and that doesn't do anything because it was already set to use that texture, but you could conceivably do this in another scenario. For now, I'm actually going to just delete the texture samples. I'm going to hold on to these, actually convert them to objects for now, and just disconnect these. So I'm going to plug this into this World Align Texture node, make another one, plug in our packed maps, and then I'm going to plug the normal into the World Align normal, and then I'm just going to grab XYZ texture, plug it into base color, grab XYZ texture of our packed map, and I'm actually going to break out float 3 components and give myself the RGB channels of this, so I can plug those into the correct spots. And then same with this, I'm going to plug that into the normal map. And now I have, as you can see, a material that's planar projecting this texture. And it's really small, which looks bad, especially if you are at human scale. That's not what we want. So luckily, there is a texture size input here, and it's a vector 3, so you could scale them, I believe, on every axis, but I typically can't think of a reason actually why you would want to do that. So I'm just going to use a scalar parameter. I'm going to call it world space tiling scale, and just set it to, I find like 300 or 400 is a good starting value. And if I just plug that into the texture size on all of these, you'll see it's already a much more reasonable scale. And then, of course, I can go into my instance and I have that scale, and I can scale that on the fly. I'm going to go back to 400. And so what's really nice about this is that it has no relation to the UV maps that are in your mesh. So if I just duplicate this mesh and I drag it along, it's just being projected in world space, so the texture doesn't even move. You know, these can meet here and it tiles perfectly. If I were to rotate this, it still works. I can intersect them, and it's you know, the texture is sort of contiguous between these two meshes. And you can even start placing like other meshes. You can basically place any mesh and throw this material on it, move it around. And what this is really nice for is, you know, ground materials that you're just having them tile indefinitely, or rocks. Rocks are really good for this kind of thing because, you know, obviously here you see some issues with these, with the tiles fucking with each other, right? And especially on a sphere, it gets pretty nasty. They don't really play nice in that way. However, if you have like a rock material that's just noise, or, you know, dirt or whatever, you don't get that kind of competing patterns, and it's incredibly useful. You can have massive rock meshes with world space textures, and you can scale them up and walk up to them, you know, at player scale, and you'll see that the side of the rock or whatever is still, you know, it's got the texel density that you would expect to see. So world aligned textures are super good, but they do have downsides. I already showed you what happens if you make a sphere, but you know, another example would be if I have a cube and I make it large, like a wall or something, and then I rotate it 45 degrees, it starts to get nasty. These get stretched out. It's actually working surprisingly well, but there you go. You see what happens, because it's projecting in the X, Y, and Z axes, and it's blending between those, but at some point they're not going to be, it's going to be trying to blend between two at wacky angles, and that just looks terrible, right? Now, it is possible to go into the world aligned node graph and add like a rotation so that it's not projecting straight forward, back, and down, but like once again you start running into the problem of needing to create a new material instance every time you have an off-axis wall or something, which is, you know, not super useful. So they all these methods have upsides and downsides. You know, if you're doing complex geometry that you're modeling a lot of in Maya, you may want to just UV it by hand. If you're throwing down a lot of pieces like this and you need them to be, you know, you need to be able to scale them in real time and adjust and test gameplay or whatever, then maybe world aligned textures are good. Worth noting, world aligned textures are a little bit more expensive, so if you were making a full game, then you wouldn't want to be using these on everything, but you can use them and they're really useful. So this is basically the 3 ways that I tend to tile textures in Unreal, and it's up to you to use your judgment on for this assignment in particular. However you want to use your tiling textures is up to you. The tools are now at your disposal, so hopefully this is helpful. See ya.